This is a conversation with Professor Ansolabehere of Harvard about malapportionment. And we dive right into it, so let me introduce it a little bit. Malapportionment is a period from the mid to late 1800s through the early 1960s, when about half of states fail to draw legislative districts that are anywhere close to equal in population. So some legislative districts have way more people than others, kind of like the American Senate. We talk about the consequences of malapportionment and then reapportionment when this finally changes, when the Supreme Court intervenes in 1962 and then in 1964. In the North, the consequences are kind of what you'd expect, which is that the North becomes more liberal as the cities and the suburbs gain more power. But in the South, you have something different take root. It turns out that southern suburbs are really conservative. They're among the most conservative areas in the country. And so when reapportionment elevates the urban and suburban core, the South actually becomes more conservative. But perhaps the most important consequence of reapportionment is that it opens the door to party realignment, particularly in the South, because in the South you had this breed of kind of Southern white supremacist, oftentimes New Deal Democrat who had a lock on Southern politics. But after reapportionment, and then after the Civil Rights Act, which was passed around the same time, you have a South that increasingly becomes conservative and Republican, and you have a sort of Democratic Party that becomes multiracial and quite liberal. So you just have a complete inversion of party politics in the South. At the same time, in the North, the Democratic Party becomes more liberal and the Republican Party more conservative. So what's really fascinating here is that while reapportionment has this really kind of almost opposite effect on the North and South, the North becomes more liberal, the South becomes more economically conservative. It has a homogenizing effect on the parties, like a really radical homogenizing effect on the parties. So I found this conversation fascinating. I think this is perhaps the most important structural change in American politics in the last century. So please enjoy my conversation with Professor Ansalabehere. I am here with Professor Ansalabehere. Professor, you've written several books, but the one we are here to discuss today is called The End of Inequality. It's a wonderful book. So just to raise a few statistics here, by 1950, on average, the most overrepresented district counted 20 times less than the most underrepresented district. By 1960, it was 35 to 1. In Connecticut and Rhode Island, 10% of the population could elect a majority of members of the state legislature. California and New Jersey, 15% of the population could elect a majority of the state legislature. I mean, do you have a favorite example of the severity of this malapportionment?
Those are great examples. Some of them would be just in one chamber, like the state Senate would have that inequality. And California was pretty remarkable because I think these are places people know, but Inyo County, which is very rural, only had 4,000 people, and LA County had at that time 6 million, and they each had the same number of state senators. Connecticut was really bad too, because they had town level representation. So there were little towns like Hebron that had one state rep, and 400 people, and then Hartford would have one rep. It was just like really out of whack. The state legislature was in charge of drawing its own districts, still is in most places today, but there was nothing that would force state legislatures to fix it. And because the people in power were going to hold on to their power, you couldn't build a coalition that would willingly change their districts.
Maybe if we could start by speaking to some of the ideological consequences of
Okay.
malapportionment.
So the ideological consequences were somewhat uneven around the country, depending on the nature of the places that were underrepresented and the nature of the places that were overrepresented. nearly everywhere the pattern was rural areas were overrepresented and urban and suburban areas were underrepresented. Urban areas tended by that time to be fairly democratic. So if you just looked at it at a high level, you'd think that the left was going to get better and the right was going to get worse. But that's not the entire story, because the suburbs were actually, in most states, the worst represented, not the urban core. In the Northeast, the suburbs were pretty liberal and pretty democratic compared to the rural areas. But in the South, especially in the deep South, places like Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, the rural areas were actually, a lot of them were old time FDR New Dealers, and the suburban areas were what we think of as at that time, the emerging majority that was behind Nixon. Some of the most conservative voters in the country were in the suburban areas of the South, and they still are. And so the old line New Deal conservative Democrats in the South got squeezed out. They were largely rural, but they were replaced by much more conservative uh, Republican voters in the suburbs, who ultimately become the basis for the Reagan coalition. The malapportionment correction happens fast and quietly. People weren't taking to the streets. People weren't protesting. There was not loudness about this. There wasn't like any of the stuff we're witnessing right now over redistricting was not happening. They just people realized this was going to happen. It was clear what you did. The courts enforced it. And within 5 years, from 1965 to 1970, not almost all of it was gone.
Right, which is, of course, in stark contrast to the consequences of other Supreme Court decisions.
Yeah, Brown v. Board of Education took forever. Bro took forever. And they also created other conflicts. This didn't, apart from realigning things, it didn't create any new conflicts.
Do you think it's an exaggeration to say that the South was autocratic before the end of malapportionment and the Civil Rights Act?
Well, it was a one-party system as opposed to an autocracy. But the reason it's not an autocracy is these states had a lot of competition within the Democratic Party. But it was more like Japan for many years was governed by the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, and it had no opposition. But everything had to be worked out inside the LDP. Likewise, in the South, everything had to be worked out inside the Democratic Party, and that party was dominated by rural districts.
There was also more of a distinction between distributional politics and racial politics. Like today, these two travel together more often than not. Back then, there was kind of a breed of distributionally liberal, racist Southern Democrats, right?
Yeah, that's the Southern Democrats that were behind the New Deal coalition were very much that. They wanted to maintain the old social order in the South, and that meant keeping civil rights off the agenda. And Lyndon Johnson in the late 50s had kind of an about face on civil rights and put it on the national agenda. And we got when he was Senate Majority Leader, and that was a real break point.
Right. With the end of malapportionment, with the reapportionment decisions, does the South actually become more conservative, or does the South largely stay about ideologically where it was before?
So the voters don't change. It's just who the representatives are changes, and the South does become a lot more conservative, a lot uh, um, uh, on a bunch of economic issues. This is really when race and economics start to get tied together. They were equally or even more conservative on racial issues, actually. If you look at some of the old polling data from the 1960s, people who lived in the suburbs in the South were more conservative than people who lived in the rural areas on racial and other cultural issues, religious issues, and things like that.
Are Southern suburbs still the most conservative part of Southern states?
Yeah, and most of them, they're still the most conservative. There's an economic dimension and a social dimension, and they're conservative on both. That really makes them quite conservative.
Interesting. It's interesting because kind of cities tend to be more liberal across the country. I mean, why is there such a difference of political valence between suburbs of northern and southern cities?
Part of it's religion that bears on the work I'm doing with my colleague Brian Schaffner right now, but half of all white evangelicals live in the South. And among religious voters, that's the most conservative group. In the Northeast, there are almost no white evangelicals. That's an overstatement, but it's pretty rare. You get more Catholics and traditional Protestants, and Catholics and traditional Protestants are kind of 50-50 voters. And, but they're also in the suburbs better educated. That makes them a little more liberal and things like that. So it's like, that's like, oh, okay, that's why the suburbs are that way. But in the South, the suburban voters tend to be wealthier, economically more conservative. In the North, the suburban voters favor regulation more than in the South. South, they want complete deregulation. You just think about the economic policies of a place like Texas compared to California or New York. Right? Texas wants to get rid of all sorts of obstacles to development. Suburbs of California and New York, they're like, no, 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 environmental protection is really important. That's what we want. That's the heart of the economic differences between them. But then you layer onto that, they tend to be like, Episcopalians or Unitarians in the suburbs and around New York, like New Jersey and so forth. And in the South, they're going to evangelical churches. And that's a really different kind of moral value basis.
How would have the politics of the Civil Rights Act played out differently in a continually malapportioned America? I mean, people forget, but like when the Civil Rights Act was passed, I believe that more Republicans supported it than Democrats in Congress. Of course, kind of in the long run, Democrats became the party of the Civil Rights Act, and Republicans were for some time the party of the opposition to the Civil Rights Act. But how different would that politics have been in an America that continues to have these kind of entrenched malapportioned districts?
Yeah, you would have a lot more resistance, maintained resistance in the South because it wouldn't have been one party against it. It would have been both parties against it. And if both parties in the state are resisting, in not just one state, but a region that's like a third of the population, that's a tough road for the federal government to implement something. So I think that would have been much more contentious. I also think that things like the eventual the implementing legislation and amendments in the 1980s wouldn't have happened. That really opened the door to a bunch of voting rights reforms in particular. And I think the courts would have remained closed at least on the electoral side of the Voting Rights Act. This really helped open up the courts' willingness to take on issues like this. And the Voting Rights Act, for example, could have really been much more narrowly construed than it was had Baker not been around.
The paradox I'm tripping over here is at the same time you're saying, but for reapportionment, implementation of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act would be a far more difficult task. On the other hand, a reapportionment made the South more conservative, not less. So how do you square that circle?
Yeah, I think that the better characterization of the South is that it became contested for a good 20 to 25 years. Not only did the Republicans suddenly find that they had a right wing, which they never had before, but the Democrats now find that they have black members. Like there were no black representatives in state legislatures, and they become the most loyal Democrats in the country. They still vote 85-90% Democratic. And so that was this change. Suddenly the Democratic Party looks very different. So the party competition, the party deals in the legislatures and so forth become very different than they had been before. The old Southern Democratic Party would literally just table any discussion of civil rights in the South, any efforts to fix the issues in the South. After Baker and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, it's suddenly on the agenda, not only at the national level, but in the states. And there are people, state legislators, who are willing to pay the political cost or put it up there, or they represent that constituency and they weren't there before. So it's suddenly being fought over in a way that it never had been.
Yeah, shifting gears a little bit to kind of the consequences of reapportionment in the North. How different would Northern politics be today, in your view, in a malapportioned state?
Well, first of all, the suburbs the suburbs in the north are not as conservative as the rural areas. In many ways, on social issues, they're far to the left of the rural areas. So if you imagine, the way to think about it, I think would be take a state like New York or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania. The suburbs have had very, very little representation. And those that's about half of the districts in most of these state legislatures. So um, you would have had this more of this conflict between the 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 overrepresented rural areas, fairly conservative. Like if you drive to Western Massachusetts, you see a lot of Trump signs, upstate New York, and so forth. So that those voters would have had much more say, much more representation, and the urban voters gained the central city voters. They gained a bit of representation, but nothing compared to the suburban areas. So the contemporary discourse we have about American politics is that the swing voters and the swing districts are all in the suburbs. And that just wouldn't be our discourse. We'd be talking about the rural areas in the North and in the Midwest.
You write in the book that malapportionment was one of the last obstacles to party realignment.
Yeah. So up until 1964, 1965, Democrats had a really solid lock on the South. In fact, in many of these state legislatures in the South, there were no Republicans. Like in Mississippi, there were no Republicans in the state legislature, but they were an old school Democrat that had been aligned with DR and the New Deal. And in the Northeast, a lot of the Republicans that had occupied some of these seats were kind of old school moderate Republicans. And there had been this building pressure for a realignment that eventually shows up in full force in the 1980 election. There weren't enough seats, for example, to build up a Republican Party in the South or a Democratic Party in the North and outside of the cities. And suddenly malapportionment gets rid of that barrier, and you get this very rapid change. In the span of a decade of years, you get these shifts. Like California was a big change.
Right. Right. For example, one case study here is Alabama, where there was an alliance between the northern industrialists and the rural white supremacists, where the white supremacists were able to perpetuate Jim Crow, and the industrialists in exchange got favorable policies.
Yeah. And so they also kept things off the agenda that would be a problem. But suddenly you get all of these relatively liberal northern suburbanites showing up state legislature first and then showing up in Congress. And they move the Democratic Party to the left and they start pushing for civil rights, for environmental regulation, things that the Southern Democrats would never have backed. Now the Southern Democrats are gone, the Republicans start shifting to the right on a lot of these issues and they start pushing their own agenda. And so we just see this like shift, this like realignment where the North becomes clearly left. And you have to remember, like, New York was a toss-up state. California was a toss-up state up until really the 1990s. This was not an incremental change. It was like swept out hundreds and hundreds of state legislatures. Just like in some of these states, actually, it's probably on the order of thousands when you add up all the state legislative seats that had to shift. Um, and so this was a very sudden shift, and the parties really are rooted in the states. That's like where the organizations are. That's where the potential candidates come from, and so forth. And some of these state party systems, they just dried up. Like the Democrats in Alabama, by the time you get to the late 80s, they'd have no bench. They've got no people coming up. And the parties as organizations, when they're thinking about like, well, what issues are we going to put out there? What's our agenda? Um, the Democrats suddenly inherit this socially liberal left wing that they never had before. And so they need to start making decisions about what issues to forward, what positions to take on them, and so forth. And the Republicans, that had been this very moderate organization. They were putting, people like John Lindsay, the mayor of New York, was like a leading candidate in 1964. It's like, so those people suddenly find there's no left wing of their party anymore. That all goes away. And there's this emerging new set of people like Newt Gingrich and so forth who are leading things in a different direction, or trying to draw the party closer to what would ultimately become kind of the Ronald Reagan organization.
If you were a betting man, would Congress have eventually stepped in?
No, I don't think they would have, because so many of them came up through the state legislatures. The American politics, even though we think of the states and the federal government as separate, they have really tight relationships between the House of Representatives and the state legislatures. And some of it's like, who's your potential threat to run against you, and how do you navigate and maintain those relationships? And I think Congress would have remained on this issue much more conservative than it ultimately became.
So to summarize a little bit, to synthesize kind of what we're talking about, the sort of multi-generational political repercussions of reapportionment. And what I hear you saying is, uh, first, the immediate consequences. In the South, it elevates both the North and the South. It elevates cities and suburbs, but cities and suburbs are quite different in the North and South. So in the South, overall, the kind of elevated population tends to be more conservative, particularly the suburbs. In the North, it's more liberal. In the South, because this is happening at the same time as party realignment, this elevates kind of the newly conservative Republican Party and makes way for a racially and economically progressive Democratic Party, while in the North, this elevates liberal Democrats in the suburbs and in the cities. So how different would the world be? Well, you have the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act would be harder to administer without reapportionment because you wouldn't have really any political coalition in the South to work with at all, and having some political coalition in the South was quite important. And until the famous midterm elections in '94, you still had a functioning Democratic Party. You had a significant Democratic Party in the South that would on occasion win. Bill Clinton famously, of course, carried Arkansas. And so that creates space for implementing the Civil Rights Act. Meanwhile, in the North, you have just much more politically important cities and suburbs, and kind of the entire politics today of how will the suburbs vote, how will they turn out, the focus on the suburbs and the kind of politics of liberal states, which tends to be pretty dominated by suburbs and cities, would have maybe resembled the politics of more rural states a little bit more closely. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. And then when you put those coalitions together at the national level, you take the New Democrats in the South, largely black, large or inner city liberals, and you put them together with this new Democratic Party in the North that's the cities and the suburbs. And suddenly you have this much more liberal Democratic Party nationally. It takes a while for that to work its way out entirely, and then the same thing's going on with the Republican Party. The Republicans lose a bunch of liberals in the North. And those become liberal Democrats, because there were a bunch of states where they were electing liberal Republicans in the rural areas, moderate Republicans, and those go away. So the Republican Party's left is like much more shifted toward the these new suburban Republican districts in the South. When you put the two different regional patterns together, this the national politics change.
The first draft of political science and legal history on the reapportionment cases seemed to come to the conclusion that the cases were quite a bit less consequential than Justice Warren would have you believe. But you do quite a bit of empirical work to show that the cases were in fact consequential.
Yeah, there's some really important and influential work by prior scholars in this area who think about like the impact of courts on policy and politics, looking at different big bodies of law like Brown v. Board of Education and Roe v. Wade and the court cases that come after that. And Jerry Rosenberg's book, The Hollow Hope, is a really great example of that. And one of his cases is the Baker decision and the subsequent one person, one vote cases. The conclusion he came to was that the consequences of this were pretty minimal. And it stemmed from a first wave of empirical research in the late 60s and early 70s on malapportionment that really kind of mismeasured what the effect were going to be. They were looking at state level numbers, and the effects were all within the states, right? They were all like, did the urban or suburban area get more powerful compared to the rural within New York State, not like what happened to the level of funding in New York State. And so what we were able to do is like piece together that more local, regional, within the state story. And when we did that, completely different picture emerged about the consequences of Baker.
Right. And again, you track both the ideological consequences and the distributional consequences. And you find that that in states which experience a leftward shift, you had significantly, I believe, 13% higher growth in social spending, 22% higher growth in welfare spending. Essentially, the kinds of trends you would expect to find if you believe that reapportioning would be reflected in policy.
Yeah, or that representation matters. Even
Right.
simpler conjecture. We think that representation matters. So if you move things to the left, what's going to happen if you move things to the right? Those earlier studies also, combine out the Alabama case with the New York case. And so they didn't distinguish the fact that some of these states were actually going to move to the right. That was just not in the mentality. Everybody thought this was just going to move everything everywhere to the left. And it didn't.
Right.
It moved things apart. But it also had this huge consequence internally. Like urban counties like Los Angeles were grossly underfunded because of malapportionment. And as soon as this is over, by the time you look at the 1972 state budgets, the money shifts. It's just like it's a step function almost in terms of how much money went into the urban areas. And it also comes out of the rural areas. I remember as a kid driving through Nevada with my dad, and he pointed out like this incomplete highway. He was an auto mechanic, so he cared about cars quite a bit. And this like highway ramp that just stopped. And the idea that like you just stop and not finish a project was like stuck in my head all these years. And when I was writing this, I just kept remembering this image of like, there must be like incomplete projects because the money dried up that fast. It was way more severe than what we're going through in like higher education right now, for example, with budget cuts and things like that. It was just like the money just dropped, and it dropped for schools, highways, water, and other infrastructure. It's just like it just vanished because we had the representation to get the money.
Well, yeah. How much of how salient was this politically? Right. There's some evidence that again, there's the John F. Kennedy writes a New York Times article specifically about malapportionment. What was this actually? I mean, senators put things out in the New York Times pretty regularly. Was this actually a salient political issue?
I think in a bunch of states, it was a very big issue, like places like Connecticut and California. Many people just thought it was normal. So it's like, oh, well, this is the analog to the federal system. It's like, so many people accepted it, but they couldn't imagine what an alternative would be. In states like Tennessee, people were pushing many ways to try to get change. And not succeeding or not finding entry, and the 1960s lawsuits weren't the first go at this, and there had been prior conflicts over census counts and so forth that foretold where we were heading. For example, in 1921, Congress voted not to certify the U.S. Census because that was the first census showing that a majority of Americans lived in urban areas. Congress couldn't accept this. So that was the beginning of the trend. And from 1921 on, you've got all these pretty ugly fights in the legislature, Congress, state legislature, over this issue. Many of them stayed in the legislature and didn't filter out into the public so much. But people were frustrated. Cities felt underrepresented, and there was a lot of complaints about like we can't get enough money for urban renewal and these other things that suddenly pop up in the 1970s. The other thing is, so I talked to a number of politicians from that era who were still alive when we were doing this. And one of them I was really impressed by was a guy named Jim Mills. Jim eventually became the Senate Majority Leader of the uh, California State Senate. He'd been um, in he'd been a state rep, was the kind of one of the lieutenants for a very controversial speaker of that assembly named Jesse Unruh. And he, when reapportionment hit, he ran for state senate instantly. He just hopped up. So, but there was just a bunch of opening of the political world in a place like LA or San Diego County that just wasn't possible before. And these were super talented people who'd been kind of frustrated and blocked out of politics. So I think that at that level, we saw a lot more enthusiasm and interest, and people were very aware of it. Hard to say, like at the very lowest level, man on the street, maybe they weren't thinking about this so much, but certainly at this kind of like city council, county commission, people involved in local politics, people in state legislature, they were very much attuned to this. And it really changed a lot of political careers.
Was it one of the top 10 issues in a presidential race
Yeah,
anytime in
never,
the 20th century?
never ever became a big presidential issue. This was never going to change a presidential election, but this was a big concern, reapportionment, all the politics around it, big concern for the House. The Senate didn't care as much. So it's kind of interesting that John Kennedy was writing about it. And Massachusetts was never that bad. Massachusetts was bad in other ways. Like, we didn't
I think he
draw
was
fair
looking beyond
districts.
Massachusetts.
We didn't draw fair districts, but a pretty bad partisan gerrymander. In fact, the gerrymander comes from Massachusetts. Like it's a cartoon of a district that was drawn in 1810. So it's like that's the whole thing comes from here. But we weren't malapportioned as much as other states were. But this was a big issue for the House, really big issue, and and it remains a big issue for the House. The great grandchild of these cases, of course, all the cases we're going through right now is whether the courts are going to step in on partisan gerrymandering, and it's front and center for the parties and the members of Congress.
To that point, by the way, of this being a big issue to the House, one of the things I found surprising and upsetting was apparently we got pretty close to either jurisdiction stripping or to actual constitutional amendment after the reapportionment line of cases.
Yeah. So there were some big efforts to walk this back in the year or two afterward, both in the House of Representatives and many state legislatures. You could have imagined the state legislatures would have used that constitutional amendment power to make that change. And I think that was a big fear at that moment politically of the Warren Court and also the Johnson administration that was going to get changed, that the state legislatures were going to amend the Constitution on this point, the U.S. Constitution.
Right. So there were several distinct attempts. So that there was first an attempt to jurisdiction strip, right? That
Yep.
was in the House, I believe, or was it the Senate?
Yeah, that was the House.
That was the House, and it passed, right?
Yeah, it passed,
it died in.
and it died in the Senate.
Why did it die in the Senate? Like, what were the politics of, say, the jurisdiction stripping bill?
I don't think it could get to past cloture, and given that they couldn't get enough votes, they just gave up on it.
And was it a clean partisan vote or no in the House where it did pass?
No, none of these votes were clean. It was just like very complicated, shifting coalitions, people making backdoor deals, people having personal understandings of their state legislatures, and they might see like this is going to affect the state legislature in a way that's actually favorable to me. So like, let's do that. Let's stick with this. So the political interests in this were very complicated and hard to pull apart, which I think is one of the reasons why it was hard for the Congress to step in. It was like there were so many cross purposes and interests and potential career implications that they just couldn't do it.
Would President Johnson have vetoed the jurisdiction stripping bill, you think?
Yeah, I think he would have. At that point, Johnson was pretty tied into the Warren Court's agenda, and then there were further efforts and attempts to limit, but they just couldn't get off the ground after the '64 election.
Right. But I guess the thing I found surprising was that nationally there must have been quite substantial support for population representation. Just if you took a national vote or a national survey, given that the country had substantially urbanized and a substantial majority of the country lived either in urban or suburban areas, since, as you've noted, 1921 was the first census that found that to be true. So I guess kind of as a first approximation, you would think that the federal government would overall be more supportive of population-based representation.
Actually, our starting point on this whole journey into this was the question you just posed, or the puzzle, which was in the middle of that earlier controversy about the census. California had not reapportioned and or redrawn its state legislative districts. And there was an initiative put on the ballot to force that reapportionment. And somebody put a counter initiative on, which was to change the state constitution to one county, one vote. And the first one lost, and the second one passed. And this was our puzzle. How did a majority of people vote to disfranchise themselves? Why would they do that? Right? It's like really troubling. If you think about, like, to a first approximation, you think you'd vote with your numerical interest. Like, no, no, no. So it's just, it turned out politics were really complicated because there was like multiple layers in California. There's this north-south enmity. Like the Northern California folks were really nervous about LA and its growing power in this in the state. So part of it was about trying to rein in LA. And so the northern counties, even San Francisco County, which at that point was the largest or second largest county, voted to give their own votes away so that they could limit LA. So some of this was like that regional competition within the state. And then if you thought that the LA was going to be very Republican and you were a Democrat, you voted against that because you wanted to keep LA's power in check. And then there were the rural areas who wanted just to keep the cities in check. And those three things, the regional competition within the states, the party competition within the states, and how it lined up with the different cities, and the urban rural, created these weird coalitions against a democratic solution. And so in many states did vote for malapportionment when it came up to ballot measures. It's very weird.
Yeah, I think you're referring to, this was, I think, 1926. And then California, several times after that, again, right? So I think 1948 and 1960. But 1948, I really don't quite understand, because even LA County votes against a plan that wouldn't reapportion on the basis of population, but would be a little bit more proportional than the 1926 plan. So do you have an understanding of what happened then in 48?
Yeah, it was like the same politics on a smaller scale. So LA County is enormous, biggest county in the most populous county in the United States. Even then, it's like this enormous place. But LA City is only a part of it. And so it's got this huge rural area. And it's also got these other, less urbanized areas. And those areas voted heavily for it, heavily to keep the malapportionment going. And the city is like, no, 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 we need more votes. But then even within the city, there were these partisan splits, and you can see the schism there, where they were kind of vote there. If you're a Democrat at that time in California, it's like a really different political orientation than today. Like if you're a Democrat in LA, you're really sympathetic to the guys in the rural areas, and those Democrats are voting like the rural area Democrats. So it's this weird overlay of urban rural politics with party politics, creating the peculiar result that LA County itself votes to disenfranchise itself.
Right. Was it in 48, was it a matter of like kind of labor politics? Because it seemed, sort of, it was the unions that sponsored the proposition. And I think a lot of the opponents kind of labeled it as unions attempting to power
Socialism
grab
and
socialism.
yeah. becomes a flashpoint for all those other ideological schisms.
The criticism of malapportionment is that it's anti-majoritarian, that it frustrates the majorities. Like, if the majority is voting to deplete the voting power of the minority, that obviously poses a deep problem for a democracy. But if a majority consistently votes to deplete the power of the majority, then it's less clear the kind of majoritarian valence of the. So does this complicate the kind of political process theory of judicial review?
So there's a legal answer and a political science answer. The legal answer is this came up in the Colorado case, 1964-65. And the Warren court looked at that and said, no, even if it was passed in an initiative, even if a majority of people voted for malapportionment, it's still not acceptable, because at that point they had worked through the proposition that equal protection meant operationally one person, one vote. But for them, that's the legal answer. The political science answer is this is like the heart of politics, or popular politics. And at any moment, there are actually multiple majorities. You can think of many different ways of making a majority. And that's part of the complexity of, say, party change at this time. It's like there were many ways, there were many pathways forward after this. It's hard to imagine all of them, and many ways that we could have evolved into a different society. But this sped up a certain path that we were on. In this case, it kind of accelerated a path where the rural areas became a lot less powerful in a place like California. And by the time you get to 1980, the California politics are rapidly leaving the era of Reagan. Reagan was no longer about California by 1980. And by the time you get to 1990, the Republicans are forever in the wilderness. That was the end. That is like the last gasp of the Republican Party, really, in the state of California. They have just like really not had anything other than, the occasional weird victory, like Schwarzenegger. And it's like, and he wasn't really a Republican.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another kind of, because there were multiple ways in which you could have put majorities together. So political scientists are like keenly interested in this question of like, how do you think about the multiple majority problem, and what does it mean to talk about representation or legitimacy and so forth if there are potentially multiple majorities?
Right. So in other words, one way to read the California story is the urban suburban majority voting to dilute its own voting power. A different way to read the California story is the not LA majority voting to decrease LA's voting power. So something to that effect, right?
Yeah. And in the context of the US constitutional theory, that would be a really bad outcome. That would be a majority taking minority rights. That'd be like classic tyranny of the majority.
Right. And one of the great twists in the story is that 1948, one of the opponents of the more population-based representation plan is the governor, who happens to be Earl Warren, right?
Yeah. No, it's like there are a lot of ironies in the 1948 election in California. And Warren and Brennan are Eisenhower's two picks for the court. And at the end of his term as president, someone asked him what is his biggest regret, and he said, pointing Earl Warren, and my second was Justice Brennan.
One of the papers that I'm sure you're familiar with that I really liked, the Pildes paper of separation of parties,
Yeah,
not powers.
yeah,
Right. So the argument they make in that paper is that if you are to have some, or at least I think one interpretation of the argument they make, if you are to have some counter-majoritarian institutions, then at least they should represent the true social cleavages. Let's say that you are designing a political system, and let's assume for the sake of argument that you want some counter-majoritarian features of this system. Was the design of the California legislature, the post 1926 California legislature, a poor use of counter-majoritarian institutional design?
I think it was. If you're going to have a representational system of government, the central institution has to reflect popular will. I find the Senate frustrating. I understand why we have the Senate. I don't think our politics would be worse if we got rid of it, though I see some reasons why it might, because the Senate does have a particular counter-majoritarian function, and maybe the states lost some of that. The balancing of parties is really what Rick Pildes is bringing up, is like, if you get unified political control of the institutions of government, so you have the majority of the Senate, the majority of the House, you control the president, you've got most of the justices, etc. The fear is that you would have the one party, just the base of that one party could really push the public policy in some unfortunate directions that are very non-majoritarian. So I think even behind Rick Pildes' argument is a fear of non-majoritarian outcomes, even though it's about counter-majoritarianism. So the divided government is almost like Rick's ideal. A divided party control of government is like Rick's ideal. And so I am uncomfortable with that as an institutional approach or a constitutional approach. That's much more like a European government. And I think if we're going to go that route, we might as well go all in rather than to cobble it together with separation of powers. So if you want to be partisan and let it be a true mechanism of accountability. That is, Parliament is supreme. It selects the executive. It's supreme over the legislature. If you don't like it, Parliament falls and you have new elections. That's typical European politics. We've gone in a different route. And, just as an American, I like, maybe it's just parochial or something, or having studied Madison way too much, that like I embrace the kind of Madisonian liberalism found in the US Constitution, and see that the problem that European countries run into is that there isn't choice beyond the parties. Like, we can tailor our votes. We can say like, I'm generally a Republican, but that guy's a little too extreme, so I'm going to vote for the Democrat this time. Or you can have a place like Alaska where it's just not clear that there are any real clear organized political parties the way the rest of the United States has. So you don't have to all ascribe to it. There, the parties have effectively captured the constitutions, and we don't know what the world is going to look like in 25 or 50 years for the political world, and whether these will be the same parties or whether we'll have some alternative system, a party system. So hardwiring the parties in and trying to bake in, separation of parties as a concept is, for me, a pretty uncomfortable approach, and seems to be like against the kind of basic principles, the way we've set them up.
You show in the book that malapportionment mattered. It mattered economically, in terms of who got the money. It mattered politically in terms of who controlled the levers of power. It mattered coalitionally in terms of kind of who partnered with whom. The fact that it matters isn't on its own sufficient to conclude whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But if we are to accept that government ought to have some counter-majoritarian institutions, what can we learn from this? How should we design those counter-majoritarian institutions? Who should they represent, if not urban versus rural? Like, what is the right way to fashion counter-majoritarian institutions?
So let's start with the U.S. experiment, which is bicameralism with a separate executive, and that's already got a lot of different. If you think about it as a problem of different majorities, there are many different possible majorities. Every politician in that system is fashioning their own majority. Every president's coming in with a different majority. The majority that elected Trump 1 is actually different than the majority that elected Trump 2. And Obama and Biden, they're different majorities. So even within parties, it's like not the same. It's not the same coalitions. And then their senates and their houses are different coalitions. So that creates a kind of just the separation of these distinct powers creates that kind of counter majoritarianism. There is a lot that we don't understand about how this particular system right now functions. And I'll give you an example from an article we just published in Perspectives on Politics called Collective Representation in Congress. the big question that political scientists have burned a lot of rubber on, spinning their wheels, is political polarization. And if you look at that literature, no one has offered any evidence as to whether polarization has any consequence for what laws get passed. So we decided to take a look at that. And we asked the following question, which is very much in line with the end of inequality, which is if you take 100 salient bills that have been before Congress over the last 25 years, so 4 years of bills a year, the most important things like the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and the IRA and whether to get out of Iraq and things like that. You look at the variation in public support for those bills. And then you look at the House and you ask, take the bills for which there's less support and more support. What's the relationship between the level of support and the probability the House passes that bill? And it's like a straight line, really tight. And the slope's about one. So it's like 1% more, 1% higher likelihood of passage. Then you look at the Senate and it's almost flat. It's like almost flat. It's like a little slight up slope. And some of it's like the Senate's not elected at the same time. They're not under the same electoral pressures and things like that. So a lot of different aspects of this. But then you ask the question about polarization. What's the relationship between how divided partisans, Democratic and Republican voters are on this issue and the probability it passes the House? It's flat. There's no relationship between partisan polarization and the probability it passes the House. It's just not driving what passes and what doesn't pass. What drives what passes and doesn't pass in the House is just majority support. That's working the way you'd want it to work. Then you turn to the question of the Senate, and the Senate, to my surprise, did something really different. And the more I thought about it, I was like, oh, that's kind of obvious. The slope between how polarized a bill is, so low would be almost no polarization, the Democrats and Republicans are roughly the same, to high polarization is strongly negative, almost a -1 slope. So what does that mean? That means the Senate vetoes polarized stuff. It's not highly responsive to national opinion, but it's really against stuff that's super divisive. It's like, oh, so that there's stuff like that that we don't know. And I'm a very empirical guy. So it's like, I want to know the answers to these questions before I dive into the question of like whether I should redesign the system. I don't think we as a discipline know some pretty basic things about how these things are functioning still. And especially in this current era, because we have changed. It has become more partisan in terms of people's behavior in the Senate and in the House. So it's like understanding what this new context looks like and how it relates to the kinds of laws we're getting. The other amazing thing about that is like when we talk about representation, we tend to talk about it as like if there's a higher majority for it, are you more likely to pass it? But what if we flip that around and asked, what percentage of our laws are supported by a majority of people? Things that actually got passed? And the answer was 80%. 80% of these, it's like in this sort of highly divisive, apparently totally ineffectual system, um, actually they're passing things that the majority of people want. And they're avoiding highly divisive laws because of the Senate. So it's like,
It's
okay,
not,
there's a
I mean,
lot.
the 80% doesn't quite surprise me because the more counter-majoritarian a system, the more you would expect laws that actually do pass to be very popular, right?
Exactly. So it feels to me that like the counter majoritarian parts of the system are somehow working in tandem with the majoritarian system in ways that we want. It's not like leading to a bunch of unpopular bills passing, which is, I think, the fear with the partisan dominance of politics that like one party would push something that a minority of people want and you'd get a bunch of unpopular laws. So that if I were to think about what's the diagnosis of the problem, we're not in a world where the majority party captures things and the only things that get passed are in these moments of unified control and they're really unpopular. In fact, what the majority party does when it has control is puts popular things on the agenda. it's not going to put losers out there because it's going to have to defend those losers. And the times that they have been total disasters. A really great example is when Paul Ryan, who was chair of the budget committee, was pushing his tax and budget reform law. And in the 100 or so bills that we've looked at, the least popular bill of all of them was Paul Ryan's budget reform. And he was just insistent on this. And he drove the government into a shutdown over this fight over this. And it was the least popular thing ever. Republicans hated it. Democrats hated it. It's just, and it went nowhere. It never even showed up. They passed it in the House against the majority's wishes, and it never showed up in the Senate. The Senate just squashed it. Not going to do it.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Take
It's a
care.
pleasure.
Bye.
Take care.